Hello, my friends, and welcome to Gamers Tell All, a interview series where I interview other creatives on the YouTube platforms about video games and their affect on people. And today I have with me Josh from Game Wisdom. Josh, can you go ahead and say hello?
Hi everyone, how are you doing?
I think they're doing pretty all right now that we're listening to your sultry, dulcet tones. So, Josh, if I can just ask, you've been on the YouTube platform for a good while now. What made you want to get onto YouTube to make analysis videos of video games?
Well, I started Game Wisdom back in 2012, and that was just about writings and podcasting. And I was trying to find another place to kind of grow my brand and do something a little bit more differently. And I started out on Twitch, doing game streams and things along those lines, and it really wasn't taking off. And I was much more suited for doing more record content. And I saw YouTube as an option, and I began making videos, and it started to take off. And it took a lot of learning and getting a lot of advice from people to
Mm-hmm.
keep getting bigger and bigger and improving what I can do with it. And it just kind of became another way of expressing myself and getting people to see kind of the work and my thought process on game design.
Cool. And speaking of that thought process, you've published two books already on game design, and you're coming up with a third sometime this year. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So right now I have two books out. The first one is 20 Essential Games to Study. That's kind of like an entry level book, giving inspiration to people who are looking for games to study, very interesting or unique designs. And it's kind of again aimed at like the first timer. The series I'm working on now is Game Design Deep Dive. And these are books that are focused on taking a very analytical approach to specific genres, looking at the methodology and philosophy of those mechanics. So the first book was on platformers, and right now the book I'm working on is roguelike design. So I'm looking
Oh,
at the genre as a whole and picking out the major design and system structure of it. So talking about you know what goes into making a roguelike replayable, how the design differs from other games, and kind of looking at the structure that has developed over like the last 10 or 15 years and how the genre has become more modernized and accessible over the last decade.
right. The roguelike genre has, for a very long time, been considered, I guess, very niche.
Hmm.
But since I guess the term is now roguelite, introducing elements that carry over between runs rather than starting from scratch each time, uh, that's, I guess, in terms of game journalism, the thing that gets the most attention in terms of taking the roguelike genre and making it accessible. I'm sure your book will go into significantly more detail
Hmm.
than you're going to get from your average IGN article.
Oh, yes. And yeah, that whole discussion about roguelite design, that's a chapter in the book for sure. Because some
Awesome.
people view it as, trolling a developer, but there are very unique structural differences between a game that is built on that level of persistence versus a game that is more run focused.
Yeah, I mean, what's an example of was the Binding of Isaac the really big roguelike that didn't have roguelite uh, design aspects, or am I misremembering that?
It will probably be around like that period, like 2008 to 2012, 2013, is when we kind of saw a lot, or we began to see that experimentation. And
Right.
yeah, like years, or I am horrible when it comes to like dates and years myself. I can never remember them. But
You've already demonstrated you're better than me, so don't worry about that.
like right around that time, I think Spelunky would possibly take the crown of being like one of like the first in terms of trying to break free of traditional rogue design. And then it kind of grew from there with Bind of Isaac, FTL, and probably a few dozen other indie games that came over the last like 6-7 years that I've tried to play as many
Right,
as I could, and I
right.
probably still never got to them all.
Spelunky. Wow. I feel like it's been forever since I've heard someone mention it, but it really was one of the hot games to be talking about. And yeah, Spelunky was always mentioned
Mm-hmm.
alongside every other conversation about a roguelike game. So I guess that really did spark a sort of renaissance. And nowadays we have like the last one that really made an impression on me was Dead Cells, which
Mm-hmm.
was basically like, look, we can combine Metroidvania, Dark Souls, and roguelike all at once. And it was like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, just mash up all the genres, make it as composite as can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it like roguelikes have become kind of like the new platformers. It seems for indie devs is like if we make a really good example of it, it will propel our studio forward. And
True, true.
there have been so many of them. So many that have copied Slay the Spire. So many that have copied the Binding of Isaac, FTL, you
Yeah,
name it.
yeah. I mean, at a certain point, the genre will just solidify its norms and then tweak those norms without pushing beyond those boundaries, because then once you go beyond, you kind of are talking about a different genre at that point.
Yep.
Like with the Souls-like series of games, a lot of people were debating whether or not to even consider Sekiro Souls-like because it has no stamina bar. And yes, it has difficulty, but it doesn't have like very detailed, or I guess a very large, undetailed story that you suss out through item descriptions. Its story is significantly more straightforward. So really, the whole community was like, "Well, it's from Software though, and they're the ones who made the genre. So if they make another game, is it automatically the genre? Is that what the genre is now?" And as much as I love Sekiro, as I think I always jump between whether or not Sekiro or Bloodborne is going to be my favorite of the modern From Software games, but I kind of can't see them as being in the same genre. I feel as though Sekiro needs to be like just needs to be considered an action game where
Mm-hmm.
the main form of action is parrying.
Yeah.
It's weird. Genres in games are weird. They
Yes.
follow different rules than any other medium.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
it's such a weird element when it comes to the game industry because there are some people who will just despise like labeling their game a certain genre, and
oh
then there
yeah.
are some developers who they'll throw everything. It's a roguelike Metroidvania first person
Uh
shooter
huh.
visual novel
Uh huh.
grand strategy game.
Maybe we should just leave the idea of genre to the marketers and let game designers make what they want. So let's go ahead and move on to the question of the day, which is what is the most significant thing you have learned from a game? So, Josh, if you could tell us what game are we going to be talking about today?
All right, we're going to be talking about Super Mario 64. That
Ooh,
game that I'm
a
sure
classic.
nobody has ever heard of before, right?
No one. It's extremely niche, the most
Mm-hmm.
indie thing ever. I the just a couple interviews ago, we were actually talking about Banjo Kazooie. So we're
Yes.
going from one of our classic platformer friends to probably not probably is the cornerstone of 3D platformers in this episode. So take us back, Josh. What is the most significant thing you learned from that game?
I think for me, like Super Mario 64 came out at that period. I was still, wow, that would be what, like 95, 96. So I was like 10 or 11 when that
Mm-hmm.
one came out. So it was such a long time ago. And
Not too young, still young at heart. Still
yeah,
young at heart.
thank you. And like for me, that was not only the first 3D plat or 3D console that I really owned, but it was also the kind of like the first 3D platformer that I ever played. I remember playing it at like a Toys R Us kiosk, like when Nintendo back when that was your only way of demoing a game was to go to a major
Hmm.
toy store
And stand at a kiosk for who knows how long
until your parents drag you away. I think,
until a store clerk kicks you out.
yeah,
Uh,
and it
Go
was
on.
just such an amazing game to play. It was really like this was like Nintendo like at like the peak of their ability of design, and I think what I learned the most about that game was that you didn't have to design a game to be so linear. And what I
Hmm.
mean, until we see,
Oh, Josh, you broke up a little bit. Can you repeat yourself?
sure. Uh, the thing that I learned the most about kind of game development, what inspired me from Super Mario 64, was this idea that you didn't need to design a game to be so linear or rigid in its design. And what I mean by that is what we see from a lot of developers, whether it's from the AAA or indie space, is that they really just kind of railroad their mechanics. That
Hmm.
there's only one way to use a system, and you can't do anything else. And my voice is dying. It's always a
Take a
good
sip of
sign
water.
when I lose my voice while I'm talking. That means that it's going to be a good discussion.
Uh huh.
There we go.
You.
And one of the things that Nintendo has always been really good at is kind of getting the most out of their mechanics. It's not just Mario runs and jumps. Is that we can add in, the suit powers from the original ones, or in Super Mario 64, there's not just one kind of jump. You can do a triple jump, you can do a spin jump, backflip, long jump, all these crazy things that from the outset you think, why would I even look at that? Why can't I just jump like I did in Super Mario Bros? And then
Right.
you're just really able to explore that space. And it well, I don't think I would consider like at the same level like of emergent gameplay that we see from something like Prey or Breath of the Wild. It was really that first game that just let the player really just like mess around in the game. Like the whole
Hmm.
idea of a hub system. I mean, nobody was really using that at that time, and that like Super Mario 64 just became the foundation for so many 3D platforms.
Yeah, to a certain extent, I mean, Super Mario 64 is basically the foundation for all platformers. Like, I don't think we can even say some of them, even ones who went in a drastically different
Hmm.
direction, were to a certain extent still responding to Super Mario 64 and still using some core fundamental design mechanics. I mean, maybe you can't even call them a mechanic.
Hmm.
Systems like
Yeah.
just having a dot shadow below the character,
Oh yes.
which other 3D platformers hadn't done until Mario 64. And the one consistent problem in all 3D platformers before that game was an inability to gauge space and whether
Yeah.
or not you were above the platform. So being able to look down and see your shadow was just a pinnacle of achievement. But they went so much further.
Yeah. And
So to kind of echo what you were saying before, because I love using this phrase, I want to echo what you said, is that the sort of the design ethos of Mario 64 was giving the player an environment to actually play in, to not pursue down a linear path to see the game to its conclusion so much as it is to mess around.
hmm
And in order to enable that, they ended up being iterative upon themselves to the umpteenth degree, in that they gave you all of those different kinds of jumps. And for every 3D Mario since, they have been iterating on how many different kinds of jumping mechanics are available to the player, to the point where in Mario Odyssey, you're not even just doing jumps, but you are creating your own platform with Cappy, as well as using somersaults, rolling forward on the ground like Sonic, in
Hmm.
order to gain speed. And maybe you can help jog my memory, because I don't remember there being much in the way of alternative or expanded jumping mechanics for any of the previous Mario games, any of the
Hmm.
2D Mario games before that.
At most, we could talk about like the spin jump in Super Mario World as kind of giving
Yes.
another layer to it. But it, like you said, it really went to the nth degree with Super Mario 64. And like the whole thing, like your example of the shadow, like developers to this day still fail in a lot of cases about not
Mm-hmm.
having that shadow underneath it. I
Oh
actually
yeah.
had a section of my book dedicated to that in a game design deep dive platform.
That
And
little thing is so drastically important. I was
yeah,
playing Near Automata today just to farm up some stuff because I like that game and I wanted to go back to it. And I noticed that even though the game has a lot of platforming,
mm-hmm,
they have dynamic shadows, because dynamic shadows are like the more aesthetically pleasing, it's the more
mm-hmm,
high res thing to do. But there's no below your feet shadow, there's no indicator
yeah,
underneath you of where your feet are going to touch down. And I'm like, wow, this game, which is a character action game, it is not a platformer, has platforming challenges because they have a good movement system, but they have forgotten that basic lesson. They didn't include it because they were too busy using more modern graphics.
yeah. And it's that difference between making a game that's a 3D platformer and making a game where you just move in 3D.
Right.
And like Nintendo's just amazing success with 3D Mario games, I think in a way it kind of ruined 3D platforming for everybody else because nobody has ever managed to really go above and beyond what Nintendo has done in that space.
Right.
And you
Are
can
you saying Nintendo is the genre killer? They perfect a genre, then no one else gets to make another one?
they're just like nobody's managed to compete with them to
Uh huh.
try and elevate things beyond. And it really is a shame because I love 3D platforming and I've been trying to find more examples. I was like in my second book, I couldn't find like maybe like four 3D platformers were released in the last 10 years. And I think like two of them were from Nintendo.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like people who do try to take on modern platforming games do everything they can to stay away from Nintendo, to try
Hmm.
to stand out or be their own voice. Like Ukulele
Hmm.
was the big recent one.
Yep.
I don't think it did too well, but the game itself, I think, was really cute and had really fun ideas. But it was wearing on its sleeve that we are a Banjo Kazooie inspired platformer, and tried desperately to distance themselves from being compared to modern Mario.
And yeah, Ukulele wasn't a bad game, but it never really iterated on the formula. It was supposed to be a love letter to Banjo Kazooie,
Mm-hmm.
but again, it's that case of I already have Banjo Kazooie. Why should I buy another version of that game?
Right, right. I want to see the thing that I like, but I also want it to be new. I
Mm-hmm.
want nostalgia and innovation, which is difficult to do
Yeah,
because it's like, give me the thing I liked before, but do it different, but not too different, otherwise I won't like it.
yeah. And like again, Nintendo just squares that circle so well with the 3D Mario games. You're still collecting whatever the MacGuffin is of the game, but the jump physics and just the overall level design is unique from each game. You can see that from the paintings and 64, the galaxies, and then the kingdoms in Odyssey.
The when it comes to actually designing things yourself, is there any particular lesson that you took from Mario 64 that, say, might be able to be applied to something outside of the platformer genre? Because it's a settled argument that anyone who makes a 3D platformer needs to deep dive onto Mario 64 and, you know, do read your books, the deep dives, but like pull that apart as much as possible. Otherwise, they are doing themselves a disservice. They're trying to learn from nothing when they could learn from people who already solved more than 80% of the problems.
Yeah.
But what do you think taking from Mario 64 can do for genres outside of the 3D platform, for games that are just moving in 3D space, like you said, aren't a platformer, but should still learn?
I think one of the big things, one is, getting the feeling of movement and motion right in the player's hands. And that's another thing where a lot of 3D developers tend to struggle with it. Is that idea that it should be enjoyable moving from point A to point B. It shouldn't be, the movement shouldn't just be there to facilitate getting to the next set piece. And you can see that in games like Marvel Spider-Man, Sunset Overdrive, Just Cause,
I'll
where
throw in Nier Automata because, yes.
and that idea that I can have fun moving around. Now, I'm not just walking, I am grappling with my infinite parachute in Just Cause or swinging around buildings. And it's so hard, I think, to make that feel right because it's not something that you're necessarily thinking about when you're trying to build the story or you're building the next mission structure. And then I think another aspect that people can learn is that give the player tools that have multiple purposes or can be combined in unique ways. With Mario 64, many speedrunners and people who play that game know about how you can, transition from one jump or one maneuver from the next. A triple jump into a dive, or triple jump into a wall jump into a dive to, circumvent a situation. And it's like that kind of level or that kind of thinking starts to take us into emergent game design. And while I don't think you can really trace it too much, we can see kind of that thought process in stuff like Arcane Studios with Dishonored and Prey, where they don't just give you a tool and say, okay, you can only use this to open up the green doors. It's, you can use this in any number of ways and try and figure out, what you can do with this strange thing we give you.
Right. It's kind of like the difference between saying I'm creating a goal for the player versus I'm creating a puzzle to be solved. A puzzle has one solution because the whole point is to figure out the thinking of the person who made the puzzle. But with especially 3D games, games that use physics as part of their systems that respond to the mechanics, there is the potential for a person to create their own solution given whatever tools they have been given. And if you say, well, that creative application of the tools is scary for me. I don't like being responded to in that way by the player. So as a solution to make sure that I, as game maker, have a control over this response of the player, I'm going to limit that solution to exactly what I expect so that I don't have to feel as though I have to prepare for or address the possibility of unpredicted solutions or outcomes with these mechanics. And I think that's an intimidating thing to hear as a designer, to design in such a way where you accept, I don't know where the player is going to be or how they got there,
Mhm.
All I know is I still have to keep putting things in front of them.
Yep, and that is a very interesting parallel to roguelike design, and
Well,
the
let's
fact
hear it.
fact that you don't, as when you're building a roguelike or any game that makes use of procedural or random generation, you don't know what the player is going to be doing one or what the player is going to be at any 100% guarantee. One player could, have the best weapon in the game. Another player could be stuck with a stick and a wooden sword, and you have to design your game to accommodate those unique aspects. And it's the same thing with the 3D Mario games, that when you give the player all these abilities and powers, or in Mario's case, all his unique jumps and maneuvers, you don't know the skill level that the player is going to be at. And one of my first kind of like full feature articles I wrote, this was back in I think 2012, 2013, was comparing Mario to Dark Souls, in that
Really?
both games kind of start the player off assuming that they have some understanding, and you can approach the games differently based on the player's skill level. And we can track that or trace that back to Super Mario 64. That somebody just starting out, they're not going to be able to do triple jumps into wall jumps. They're just going to do a normal jump. And the level design has to be set up to accommodate them, just as it has to be set up for that pro player who comes back and can, speed run the entire game in an hour.
Um, I think that that feeling of being able to anticipate is is daunting because I don't think game designers, except if they're coming from a Dark Souls background where they're part of the community that really just wanted to focus on how difficult games can be and making games for those people who want a hard and grueling experience.
Hmm.
I think that making I think people finishing your game is something that's important to designers because so many people, designers included, pick up a game and will never finish it.
Hmm.
The like designers have a motivation because they're playing the game specifically to understand its structure and its goals, but then they don't have time to dedicate. They don't have the 200, 300 hours it might take to finish an open world game, even if they are designing an open world game, which they are trying to finish. So that whole, I want my players to feel good from start to finish, and I want them to actually get to the finish, is part of that daunting task. Now, I will say the idea of having multiple tools and being able to use those tools how you see fit is probably the main reason that I always enjoyed the Mario games over Legend of Zelda, excluding the most recent one, because the Zelda dungeon formula has always been get the item you need to complete the dungeon. Use that item as a key to
Hmm.
bypass the puzzles, fight the boss, go get the next special item, which will be used in the next dungeon. And really, it takes a, you know, lock and key approach to every single item in the game.
Yep.
And very rarely do you ever get to go out of that mold until Breath of the Wild came along and they said, no, we're just going to give you options and we are going to make things in the world respond consistently to those options. So you just use what you have whenever you want. You can solve problems any way you want. All of these pieces will work consistently, but they really abandoned the lock and key mentality that they had for every other Zelda before it.
Hmm. Yeah. And that kind of lock and key is one of the distinctions that we see from the Metroidvania genre. That good Metroidvania design is about, again, giving the player a tool and saying, here, use this and, add this to your routine, versus here's this key. It only works on blue door, and now go find me the red key in 5 hours.
I actually just finished Control,
Hmm.
which is described as a 3D Metroidvania. Though I have a lot of problems with how the map was actually laid out to be understandable. But the game had a kind of ethos of we're not trying to be understandable, sort of at its core. But I did notice that in terms of its combat, which is where pretty much all of the agency lied, was they had combat options that you could choose to strengthen or not, and you could get through any combat encounter, but there were some very clear uses for each power that were best. Like, there's a guy who shoots grenades at you. The best counter for that is to be in the air, because then the grenades would fall to the ground and you don't have to dodge. There's these things that just shoot a relentless barrage of bullets at you, and the best thing to do is put up your shield and just kind of wait it out and time it and dodge out of the other things that are trying to get you if that stationary Gatling gun enemy isn't the only one you're dealing with. And so there was definitely some lock and key design ethos behind that sort of pushed the player to use the different mechanics. But at the same time, if you just wanted to say, no, I'm just going to get really good at dodging and managing my stamina and do only that for every encounter because that's what you're comfortable with, you can still get through. It just means you have to be that much better with the mechanics you've chosen to use if you find the other mechanics not to your liking.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it was a soft lock, a soft key.
Mm. Yeah, and like going back to like we were just listening to something like Sekiro, that Sekiro is very much a one solution kind of game. It
Oh,
is,
yeah.
can you parry? Yes, you will win every fight. No, you will not get past probably like the second boss.
Right. And there were plenty of enemies where use this ninja tool, it's the solution to this enemy.
Hmm.
And to a certain extent, I think that lends back to how Sekiro was really more about being an action game because it wasn't about what's your creative solution to this problem, it's how quickly can you dispatch this room? And do you know what you need to do to just cut through it and get through everyone and move on to the next area? And it really did care more about speed, memorization, and timing of skill rather than are you creatively getting past this scenario. And to a certain extent, they had some mechanics that were kind of leaning like you think might be holdovers from days when they were thinking that it was going to be more open and more experimentative. Like there's this mechanic where you can, or system where you can imbue your sword with some magic, and it's usually some kind of poison or fire or whatever. But there are these one lizards in the game where if you imbue your sword by killing that lizard, you get the benefit of actually restoring health when you hit an enemy. The only problem is those lizards are in a location where you will never
Uh,
go and reach an enemy in time before the mechanic runs out. So, I mean, maybe you get a few hits in, but it's not going to last one encounter. So, there are some leftover breadcrumbs of a time when they thought they were going to be more open and creative and decided to be no straight action, get your skill up and memorize your solution. And the enjoyment comes from how well can you execute, not how well can you experiment and solve.
and the problem is that it's very hard to design a game like that. If you look
Hmm.
at something like Devil May Cry, where they give you a lot of tools of how you fight, they rate you on how experimental and the
Right.
improvisation of combat.
They want you to use all the different options, and the more options you can use without getting hit, the higher your score, the better music will play in the background.
Yeah. But the problem though is that when it comes time for a boss, most of the bosses are just very much like very simple patterns, and it's a case of okay, guy, hit the glowing part. You need to wait for him to do this exact attack that leaves him open. Do a 3-hit save combo. Repeat for the next 5 minutes.
Right. I think they did get away from that. I think they got away from that mainly with the final bosses in the Devil May Cry series, especially anytime you get to go up against Virgil,
Hmm.
because Virgil's like the poster child boss. This is the epic moment for any game.
Yeah.
But in 5 they got away from that a little bit,
Yes.
and I think it was more intentional because the early bosses did definitely have a this is your one solution to this scenario, but then as each next boss came in, as you were engaging with different bosses with different characters, they broke away from that, but they did it gradually and made it as part of their ramp up to when you get to the final fight, you are 100% needing to use every single thing that you have, but each one has a different application. Some are really good in one place, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to get some other really sick style points for doing something else in response to what might be predicted for, say, a royal guard or for, I don't know, shooting the guns. I lose track of my terminology in Devil May Cry. But yeah, I think that might have been intentional in that they wanted to use how open fighting a boss was to sort of help along the skill ramp and the excitement the player feels as they feel themselves getting more powerful, because they say in this situation this one thing you do is the good thing to do, so you do it. And in the next situation, they're like, well, these two things you can do are good. And now suddenly the player is using the two things. And then by the end of the game, they're using 10 or 15 strategies that they've learned all at once. And they can really feel that their skill has ramped up because of it.
Hmm.
So I think they restricted it in Devil May Cry on purpose to create that scaling effect of a player's perceived skill.
Yeah. And it's always tricky to know just how far you can go with that. And like bringing this back to the Mario games, like Nintendo has always done a really good job of gradually raising up the complexity or the challenge that's required by the player. And then they always save something, not exactly, Kaizo or super difficult, but there are some very tricky expert challenges that always are, like in the new game plus, or I'm sorry, like the post
Mm,
game of their
right,
titles.
right. They they make sure the main game is accessible, but do definitely key you in to how much more can be done. And I guess I'm not really familiar with what the post game challenges in Odyssey were, but I have seen people, speedrunners in particular, do absolutely crazy things with with the movement in that game. So I 100% see what you're saying. They
Hmm.
they save the biggest, most most pure demonstrations of your skill for after the game is already over.
Hmm. Yeah. And that kind of design is just, I think, very hard to pull off because, as you were saying a few minutes ago, there are a lot of people who don't finish games, who they'll
Hmm.
play maybe 25, 30%, say, yep, I got my experience and I'm done. And they'll really miss out on a lot of what this game can offer.
Yeah. It's motivating people to stick with something is hard because you never want to miss out on the new shiny game coming out around the corner, and there's always another new game now.
Hmm. Yep, and even like if you do a really good job with your design, there's no guarantee somebody's going to really play through it all.
Yeah, true. The human heart is fickle. You
Hmm.
can only do your best.
Yep.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps us up. We 100% got into the weeds for the second question of how Super Mario achieved those lessons, and I had a fun time talking very purely about game design and what it is about games that motivates players or makes us feel good while playing in that space. The I guess the only other thing for me to ask is there anything particular on your channel that you would like the people listening to this to check out if they haven't had an opportunity to yet?
Hmm. Yep. If you're interested in learning game design at all, definitely check out my Critical Thought series, where I pick just about anything and everything related to design and spend 10 to 20 minutes discussing the topic. And I do many game developer interviews. We've had guests on like Edmund McMillan. Um, Again, a lot of my audience or a lot of the developers I speak to are more on the independent space, but
Yes.
I've interviewed at this point over 600 people in the game industry over the last 8 years, and it's always fascinating to talk to developers. I spoke with Jeff Vogue, Sandy Peterson, and like people who've been around for such a long time, and that's really where I kind of grew and began to understood how to study game design, was talking to these people who make these games, because it's easy to just sit and talk about your favorite game. It's another thing to be able to sit down and analyze what was the developer's intent when they were making this. And
Right.
I basically got that by talking to developers who made the games that I was playing.
Game wisdom through dialogue. It's
Hmm.
almost like you're the philosopher here. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Josh. It was absolutely a pleasure to have you on. I'm glad I got to pick your brain a little bit.
Hmm.
There'll be a link to the one of the videos Josh has recommended in the end cards. And any last words before we go?
I guess thank you for having me on. I'm always the interviewer, and I always love it when I get a chance to be on the other side and not have
I've
to worry
turned the
about
table.
it. And it's great not to worry about audio edit. I can just talk and talk and talk, and somebody else can do all the fancy editing work.
Yeah, that'll be on me. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching once again, and we will see you next time. Bye bye. And that's an episode.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thank you.